All right, we're back. Doing it again. Man, what an adventure today has been, I'm telling you guys. Went to run a couple errands. Car battery died. Haven't had a car battery die in 100 trillion years. Actually, since the 90s, whichever one is closest. It's been a long time, so I had to call roadside assistance and sit there. Because I was like, back in the old days, I just try to flag people down, ask for a jump or some other nefarious way. I'm gonna get too distracted, but one of my first cars was an old Cadillac Eldorado that had some kind of problem where every time you'd start it, it would drain a battery. So we went through a lot of batteries in that car. Oh man. Anyway, so it's all kinds of cold out, sitting in the car, lots of fun. Um, Such not a good day. But anyway, I'm here now. I wanted to come back and finally maybe finish this discussion, which I started. People have been saying that they enjoyed the discussion. Lots of good comments, actually, some good discussion. I've been appreciating it and enjoying it. So I'm happy to do these videos. By the way, I take recommendations. So if you have something that's floating around out there that you say, hey, maybe you check this out, maybe I will. I mean, maybe I won't, but maybe I will. Um, and also, by the way, I guess I would mention that I've been thinking of doing a series of office hours where I just hang out live and talk to anybody who comes by. So the next 3 Mondays in a row, I have these live conversations. Like this Monday, coming up the 22nd, I have Michael Graziano and then Eric Switchcable, then Steve Fleming, all lined up in Mondays. But after that, probably I'll aim to do these on Mondays, a live on Monday. I got a couple other of these consciousness live things, but they're not on Mondays as far as I know. And maybe I'll do a couple before then. So I don't know. The last time I did this, it was sort of fun. So that's the plan. Um, cool. Let's get into this. So I sort of jumped ahead a bit because where I left off, they were talking about Frankish, Keith Frankish, and Daniel Dennett and illusionism. And I see there's a lot of other stuff here that I would sort of listen to about illusionism and Strawson and ontic-structural realism. These things are things that I like. But since I got into this to see what they said about Sean Carroll, and then I spent all that time listening to Sean Carroll, um, and it says in the video it's Bernardo Kastrup on Sean Carroll. I guess we should get to the Sean Carroll part. So I think I have it already queued up here, ready to go. Where is it? Oh, there it is. So that's over. After 2.5 hours, they start talking about Sean Carroll, and then on here, the first thing they say is we're on a Kastrup on Sean Carroll. Oh, they do spend a lot of time in illusionism. Whatever. No one knows how to name YouTube videos. I certainly don't. All right, where was I? I think I have it already, so I'm going to trust my former self.
Tries to say that the findings of quantum mechanics have allowed people to posit these non-physical ideas, but then he says, but that's actually not correct. So he says it's crazy to leap these conclusions about the role of the observer in the mind, and that this is old news from 80 years ago, and that there are physicalist theories that 100% explain the data. He blames
I don't know where they're getting this from. I wonder what Sean Carroll discussion or interview or whatever they're talking about. Um, like I've said before, in case anyone who doesn't know me, I am very friendly to physicalism, and I spend a lot of time arguing about it. But mostly because the people who argue with me are not physicalists. When the people who argue with me are physicalists, I will defend non-physicalist views. And quantum dualism is one that I think is interesting. If there were a place where you sort of would think maybe something fishy would happen, it would be there. Of course, I think there's ways of talking about quantum mechanics that don't involve the consciousness playing any sort of role. And I'm certainly no expert on quantum mechanics by far, but I spent a lot of time trying to understand it, and especially how it relates to consciousness. So I'm interested in these ideas. I don't know what Carroll's position. I don't know where he's talked about this, but I know he believes in the many worlds interpretation. Sean Carroll believes in the many worlds interpretation, and certainly on that view, um, consciousness doesn't have any role to play. And if that's a purely physicalist theory, then I guess yes, there is a physicalist theory. But yeah, so of course, making sense of how, the mind splits into all these different universes and stuff is something else. But um, I don't know this argument, or if anyone knows, by the way, that's watching this, knows where they're getting this from, because it wasn't in the thing I just saw with Philip Goff and Sean Carroll. So I would be curious.
Videos like "What the bleep" and all of that for making people believe idealism is true, and but that's just all wrong.
So hold on. So that what the bleep thing was very what the bleep, not good. And there is a certain weird ooey gooey interpretation of quantum mechanics that I don't endorse and don't think that this consciousness business I was talking about has anything um, very much in common with. So certainly you can't make reality into what you want it to be because of anything having to do with quantum mechanics or anything like that, or in any sense in which reality depends on the observer. It doesn't really do much other than collapse the possibilities from some indeterminate state to some determinate state in a random way, by the way. So you can't even get free will out of this. You don't even get any kind of role for the mind or anything like that. All you get is that somehow the mind or consciousness causally interacts with these superimposed states and forces them into a determinate state. So I don't know what they're talking about here or what Carroll's position on this stuff is, but maybe I should let them talk and I'd find out.
Physicists do not need to rupture the connection between quantum mechanics and physicalism.
Yeah, hold on. Let me just.
Carroll tries to say that the findings of quantum mechanics have allowed people to posit these non-physical ideas, but then he says, but that's actually not correct. So he says it's crazy to leap these conclusions about the role of the observer in the mind, and that this is old news from 80 years ago, and that there are physicalist theories that 100% explain the data. He blames videos like "What the bleep" and all of that for making people believe idealism is true, and but that's just all wrong. Physicists
Oh, they're going to talk about physical realism, huh? And these experiments having to do with physical realism. Okay, I can sort of see where this is going. But um, what am I trying to say? While I agree that you can't start from quantum mechanics and end up with um, a refutation of physicalism, or at least I think I agree with that. I don't know. Is Bernardo going to try and make that argument? But I certainly don't think that it's obvious that you can do that. Uh, Quantum mechanics is the paradigm of a physical theory. What it tells us, you might think, is something which doesn't look classical, that reality doesn't behave classically or isn't classical, depending on how you want to interpret these things. But yeah, this has got to be about physical realism. Okay, let's see, though.
do not need to rupture the connection between quantum mechanics and physicalism.
I mean, I agree with that. So that's what I was trying to say. I agree with what Carroll is saying, but I disagree that anyone is trying to argue for idealism on the basis of quantum mechanics, at least not recently. Maybe that's what Carroll meant about it being outdated. I don't know. Or unless this is what Bernardo's doing. I don't know. Now I'm on pins and needles. What's going to happen?
Okay, this is a difficult one to answer because there is a sense in which I agree and a sense in which I profoundly disagree. So let me try to be clear. I think quantum mechanics has been vastly abused by the New Age, by other people. They see a mystery and then they try to co-opt that mystery in order to substantiate whatever silly views they have. I think that's a widespread problem, and I think it is fair to point it out. I also don't think that the observer has the magical power to change the ontic structure of the world as it is. In other words, I don't think the process we call collapse is an ontic reality, an ontic change, an ontic transition in the world out there as it is in itself. We don't have this magical power of changing the world just by looking at it. I do not think.
Why is it so? This is not really a fair way of characterizing the view, calling it a magical power. So you can take the idea. This is the way Chalmers and McQueen developed the idea, which I think is useful. Take the idea of what they call an M property. So an M property is just some kind of property that resists superposition. It's a physical. I mean, not maybe a physical, maybe not. Some kind of property of a system, which resists superposition. So it doesn't want to be in a superposition state. Um, and so now if the mind or phenomenal consciousness has this property, then when the subject goes into contact with a measuring device to read out what it says, then the phenomenal states that results are going to resist superposition if they are such. And it does seem sort of intuitive that maybe consciousness doesn't exist in superpositions. Um, but I think people could debate that, I guess. But anyway, so if consciousness were such that it were, and intuitively seems like it is, that it resists superposition in this way, but other properties don't resist it in that way, then it's not a magical. I mean, I guess it's a fundamental property, but it's not magical in the sense of doing something that's violating a law of physics or something. It's just saying that this thing has a property. The property is such that it resists superposition. So when the state goes into this particular property, then it's going to be in some determinate state because of that. And as a result of that, you get collapse. So I don't know, is that magic? Is it any more magic than anything else in this debate? I don't know about collapse, I mean. But so I do think that it's not magical to think that we have, that maybe there is a property that has this attribute.
Magical power of changing the world just by looking at it. I do not think that the conscious observer has the magical power to change the world as it is in itself. But I disagree that the results in quantum mechanics have no philosophical implications, or that there is a physicalist theory, anything deserving of that name, that accounts for the results. And I will be specific now about what I mean by these results. The results I'm talking about are the results that got a Nobel Prize last year, which are based on the experiments with two entangled particles, in which one is shot at near the speed of light in one direction, the other is shot at the same time in the opposite direction. And after they cover a certain distance, two different scientists, say Alice on the one side and Bob on the other, Alice makes a measurement on particle A, and Bob makes a measurement on particle B in different places, but concurrently at exactly the same time. Now, what the experiment shows, in its many incarnations, progressively eliminating all the loopholes, arguably the final loophole was eliminated in 2015, and by 2022, that was recognized and got the Nobel Prize. What the experiment shows is that what Alice chooses to measure about particle A determines what Bob sees when Bob measures particle B. Let me repeat this so it really comes through. What Bob sees when he looks at particle B depends entirely on what Alice chose to measure about particle A, even if that other measurement was done on the opposite side of the universe at the same time before any.
Yeah, so this is clearly entanglement or something related to entanglement. And I don't see, so how is this going to play out? He's going to argue that this result counts against hidden variable views. So like I said, that there's some physical, like little particle type property. I think people dispute that. That might be why he got into a debate with Tim Maudlin, or that kind of acrimonious exchange, because I think Maudlin thinks there is such a physically. Anyway, so that's a separate issue, but I think here a lot's going to depend on what you mean by physical, because I certainly think that this is a real property. I mean, or at least, it's one interpretation of quantum mechanics in which it comes out that way, and I think there's some reason to think that. So to take it seriously and so forth. But to say that no physicalist theory is compatible with that, it's maybe no classical physical theory, and that would be my view that the nature of reality isn't classical. If quantum mechanics is an ultimate part of our completed physics, which hard to think how it couldn't be. So, if that's the case, then one possibility is that physical reality is not classical in the sense that there are determinate properties there before they're measured. There are non-classical properties there that the wave function is tracking or something like that. So that's, what are you going to say, that's not physicalism? Why is that not physicalism? So anyways, if I don't think that, so he must be trying to argue that this rules out the little variables. The little variables is only physicalist interpretation, but that's not plausible. So then physicalism is implausible. If that's the way it's going, then I am skeptical of the argument, but I don't know.
Could have been transmitted from Alice to Bob. What this shows is that, contrary to physicalist assumptions, which entail that physical entities have standalone existence, they have the properties they have regardless of observation. An act of observation merely discloses.
Classical. Yeah, classical. That's so. Physicalism isn't committed to classical physicalism, that there are these bits of things that have independent properties. Physicalism is not committed to that. That was a theory developed, worked pretty good for a period of time, and has been superseded. So physicalists are perfectly happy to update their understanding to quantum field theory. There is an argument from Susan Schneider that based on the highly mathematical nature of particle physics, quantum field theory, and so forth, that since the thing we're talking about is sort of delineated in terms of non-physical properties from mathematics, that they themselves should count as partially non-physical or something like that. So maybe you could make an argument like that, but I don't really see how you get from, well, the refutation of classical physicalism to no physical theory can handle this. I think that's too quick. I don't know. Someone suggested that maybe I should have a conversation with Bernardo, and I'm not against that. Certainly, it would depend on whether he had the time and interest, since, I don't have anything to do, really, because I'm doing this.
The properties the particle already had immediately prior to the measurement. This is contradicted by the experiment, because if particles A and B had whatever properties they had independently of measurement, then
classical properties.
Alex's choice of what to measure should not change what Bob sees when he looks at particle B. What seems to be the case is that the physical properties of particles A and B are the result of a measurement. We cannot speak of their having defined physical properties prior to the act of measurement. It is the act of measurement that brings out the existence of the physical property. Now,
the classical properties.
There are two mainstream ways. Well, mainstream, it's not mainstream at all, but there are two main ways that you can try to avoid this conclusion, and both entail unprovable, rather grotesque theoretical fantasies. One of them is...
That's the phrase that that he used in his opening comments. Excuse me, sorry. With Tim Maudlin. That's what pissed Tim Maudlin off, and Tim Maudlin said something rude to Bernardo. Because I watched that Theories of Everything discussion. I was interested to see the discussion between Bernardo and Tim. Didn't work out, but he does say this a lot. By the way, I don't think that Bernardo said that phrase as a way to insult Tim, which maybe is how he took it. I don't know. He certainly was offended by it, it seemed. But he says that phrase a lot, grotesque theoretical fantasies. Must mean he's going to talk about many worlds. We already talked about that. I don't think there's anything grotesque about that. It's a bit odd, but yeah, reasons to think that lots of things are odd.
It's the Everetian many worlds interpretation.
Ah, there we go.
You can say that all possible outcomes of measurement actually happen, but they happen in a parallel, inaccessible universe where there is another copy of you, another copy of Alice, and in that other universe, Alice has chose to measure something else about Parkaway, and all possible choices and all possible results are equally valid, and they just happen in different parallel universes. We see what we see because we happen to be in this one parallel universe. Now, this is the ultimate subterfuge, the most
Now, let me get this right. So, I'm not a supporter of the many worlds interpretation. That's not my preferred view of quantum mechanics. I much prefer, like I just said, that the idea that what it's telling us about the nature of reality is just that take it at face value, that reality is not classical, that what exists is something like the wave function. It just is that way until it's measured, then it collapses to a determinate state, a classical state. Okay, so that's, and my second favorite is like something like the Copenhagen interpretation, that it's just epistemic. And then there's these other interpretations that I think are interesting as well. And the many worlds is one of them, but it is hard to wrap your mind around how there could be, many copies of me every time you measure something, anytime you look at something. So right now I look over here, I see the wind blowing that tree. I could have looked over there, so there was a world where that happened and so forth. Okay, so you can work yourself into thinking that this is the way you should think of things. I think the most straightforward reason that serious people take this serious is that the mathematics of quantum mechanics sort of looks like that already. So if you just looked at the math of it and were like, what is this telling me? You would be saying, okay, all of this is happening at once, or everything is. So this is the way the math kind of just straightforwardly, naively presents itself. Like, look at the old ideas about how do you account for the double slit experiment? Well, the electron takes every possible path. Like, what the hell? How does that happen? Well, many worlds is a way to try to make something like that come out. Okay, so is it theoretically extravagant or not theoretically extravagant to simply go just based off the math? I don't know. If you're simply wanting to stick as close as possible to what the math tells you, then why wouldn't you be a many worlds theorist? Whereas if you are someone like me, then you've got to really, and you think that no, it's not that way. There's something that brings about a determinate state from the indeterminate state that collapses a real feature of the world out there. And if that's really the case, then randomness must be a real property of the world, and like he was saying a second ago, observers must usually probably have some impact on it. These are strange things. So I think that when you're talking about quantum mechanics, the question is like, what are you prepared to give up? Because you can't give up the mathematics of it, the experimental precision of it. And I think a point that Carroll was emphasizing in his debate, in the last one, I think is very important, is that people think there's some conflict between quantum mechanics and special relativity. And it's like, yeah, that really only comes into effect in specialized circumstances. For ordinary circumstances, there is no apparent contradiction. It's only when you have to combine them, really. So the sort of picture that we have, what he calls the core theory, which I think is just quantum field theory plus general relativity, not merged into some unified theory, but just together, used separately as tools to make predictions about things. They do a very good job. Sorry, I got a frog in my throat, so I may as well be quiet and let him talk.
inflationary hypothesis the human mind can conceive in a coherent way. Because it basically says
What is he saying? This is too
the
extravagant.
ultimate subterfuge, the most inflationary hypothesis the human mind can conceive in a coherent way. Because it basically says that whatever discombobulating experimental outcome you see, it means nothing because all the other outcomes happen in some equally valid parallel universe that is inaccessible, that we can never reach, that we can never have evidence for. So you don't need to fret about results that contradict your prejudices because all the other results that didn't contradict your prejudices, they happen in some inaccessible, invisible universe.
Wait, so I don't think this is. Am I missing something? No. So the idea is not everything which is logically possible happens every time you make a measurement. It's every mathematically allowable outcome. Every branch of the wave function or whatever. So, I get this for the multiverse. So he might be combining his critique of the multiverse. Another idea that I think is worth taking seriously, by the way, from for many reasons, but the multiverse just says, there is a plethora of universes, all with different laws out there, maybe infinite. And then some people like to say, well, then okay, so if there's infinite U's and if there's infinite variety, then chance alone is going to dictate that you're going to show up in just this situation, some alternate universe, blah, etc. But that's different than the many worlds interpretation, which just says that any mathematically allowable outcome of this observation is going to result in a world where that outcome shows up. Not that there's going to be weird ones that contradict what you're saying. That's not dictated by it. And then you have to reinterpret the Born rule as a rule about which world you're going to find yourself in. And people have debated about that. So I'm not saying there aren't problems with the many world. It's not my favorite horse in this race. But I'm not sure if maybe someone can correct me because many people have studied Bernardo's views much closer than I have, maybe he himself, whoever. I would like to know what exactly the argument is supposed to be here because I don't really see it.
If anything is a subterfuge, it's got to be this. If anything is an unjustifiable, empirically completely unjustifiable fantasy, it's got to be this because these other parallel universes not only...
Well, but it's not empirically unjustifiable. Sure, it's metaphysics. It's an interpretation of the mathematical framework. So all of these are sort of empirically unjustifiable, one might think. But I guess maybe he means something stronger, like there's just no sense in which we can relate this to something from our experience. I don't know. Like I said, the people that I know that are friendly to this view mostly talk about just look at the math. That's what it says. Like you have to do a lot of fancy footwork to explain it away. All these other worlds are already in there. That's what it says. And then what we're told is that there's a probability of seeing one or the other. So if you just take that as straight face value, the worlds are there. You don't have to make them up or add them or do anything. The other interpretations, it seems to me, sort of have to explain away those worlds. So I think that, that's that he's not being super charitable here to this view. But,
are inaccessible in practice, they are inaccessible in principle.
Yeah.
In other words...
But quantum mechanics all of this talk about probabilities and all this stuff is based on the idea. So you take some property. I thought this was going to be about philosophy of mind. Anyway, so you take some state, you put it in a superposition. Say it spins, say it's whatever. It's in a superposition of spin up, spin down. Okay, fantastic. And then you say there's a 1/2 probability of getting spin up and 1/2 probability to get spin down. What does that mean? Well, then they tell you take 100 of these things and you measure one, you get spin up, you measure the other. You're going to get some distribution. But you can never remeasure the same one over again. I mean, you can, you're just going to get the same result. You can never duplicate that superposition of that one over again. So every time you're doing it is always a new preparation, a new fundamental state that's been prepared in a superposition that you then do a measurement on, and then you add all these up and you say, okay, does it match the probability distribution that the mathematics says? So all of this stuff is, in a way, if you really It's a little bit like if you wanted to see if the probability of a coin was one half and you flipped the coin 100 times and counted how many times it was head and tails, as opposed to if you got 100 different quarters um, and flipped them all at the same time and then counted them up and said the probability of that quarter named George was one half after counting up all the different quarters. So I don't know, is that a statistically good move or not? It is a bit weird that you can never do it over again to the same one and make sure it always comes out one half. You can only do it over a group. So I don't know. Um, it's true that on the many worlds interpretation, the other world in which the thing came down as opposed to up is inaccessible. You can't go back and redo it. But that's true on everybody's interpretation of quantum mechanics. I guess that's what I was trying to say, is that yes, this is sort of more formally true for the many worlds interpretation, but it's going to be true for everybody in the sense that I was explaining, given the way that these experiments are done and so forth. So, is this fair? I don't know. I would
There
have a
will
question
never
about
be
this.
a time when we might have some evidence for their existence. It's purely a theoretical fantasy. And it's the most inflationary theoretical fantasy that can be conceived, because it means that the universe splits in two equally large universes every time there is a microscopic subatomic interaction anywhere in the universe. This makes the Big Bang look like a bang snap. It is a exponential thermonuclear explosion of empirically unverifiable stuff. You cannot wrap your head around how empirically unfalsifiable, how much of this stuff is supposed to be out there, and you can never have evidence for it. I mean, if you take this seriously, I cannot. My intellect is put together in a way that I cannot possibly take this seriously. I mean, this is the ultimate subterfuge to.
What is subterfuge, as far as I know, means like deception. So what's the deception going on here? So once again, it's just from the math. Like you have the math. There's these many possibilities. So why not think they're real? Okay. So is that any stranger of a view than that reality is not classical, or that the goal of science is not to answer fundamental questions about reality, or that you pick? Is that any stranger of a view? Of course, the one everyone would like, that there's some kind of classical story about the world that would make sense of all this quantum mechanical stuff. That one is I think the one that's in the most trouble. But even that one, I don't think is clearly refuted. Although I don't know. I would like to see someone more knowledgeable than me discuss this. All right, back to the rant.
Maintain your prejudices in the face of evidence. It's this. If anything is the ultimate subterfuge, it is this. The other one is called superdeterminism. And what it says is the following.
Oh yeah, I forgot. This is all like, how could physicalists save themselves from the entanglement stuff? And one of them was the many worlds interpretation, which he thinks is grotesque theoretical fantasy. I don't think so. So that's one view. The other is going to be superdeterminism. He's not going to even mention just the view like, wave function realism, or the reality is not classical. Okay, interesting. Superdeterminism, I want to hear what he has to say about this, because I never really understood the difference between superdeterminism and just regular determinism. As far as I understand it, superdeterminism is supposed to be that somehow all the experimental outcomes are determined in such a way that, and the researchers themselves are determined in such a way that they'll only pick certain variables. So imagine Alice and Bob. Alice is measuring her spin or whatever, and Bob's over there, and Bob thinks he can pick between these two things, but really he's determined already to pick the one. He doesn't really have a choice or something like that. And I guess the main objection is that even if you like determinism, and that even if you think there is no free will, that this involves things being set up in a certain way, like super determinism. It's almost like fate. that every experiment that's ever been done on quantum mechanics, the researchers who did it were determined in just that way. I don't know, is that really super determinism or is it just regular determinism? Could you imagine a world in which quantum mechanics was true and people didn't have free will, and yet Bob chose to measure some other thing than he did or something like that? I don't know. So it does seem like a conspiracy of the universe to make sure that we think quantum mechanics is true. You know, super determinism could be true if, like, we're in a simulation, guys, and they want us to think quantum mechanics is true when it's not. Is that supposed to be the? I think that's the level of paranoia we'd have to be at to think that super determinism were the explaining factor. Yeah, I don't really know anyone who supports super determinism. I should find someone and see what they think about this.
Parameters of the measurement apparatus determine what the particle that is measured is. So the particle that was there before you measured is not the particle that is there after you measured.
Oh.
So to bring this to life with a metaphor, the analogy here is the following. Suppose that you are a photographer and you want to photograph the moon. And the moon you have to photograph at night, so you have to choose the settings of your camera very carefully. The exposure time, the aperture, you have to choose them carefully to make a proper photograph of the moon. Superdeterminism in this analogical context means that the choice of the aperture and exposure time in your camera will determine what the moon is. The settings of your camera will change the moon. So the moon that appears on the photo is not the moon that was there just before you snapped the photo, because the settings of the camera when you made the photo changed the moon. So even if what you see on the photo is not consistent with your prejudices, you can ignore it because the real moon that was there before the photo was something else. And it's something else that you cannot know. But that's not the worst. The worst.
So this doesn't sound like super determinism that I know. This sounds sort of like reality is not classical. But I don't know. Super determinism is not something I'm fully up to speed on, so I could be totally off base.
Part is that, remember.
Wait, what did he say?
But that's not the worst. The worst part is that, remember, what Bob sees depends on what Alice chooses to measure. Even if Bob is on the other side of the universe and the measurements are concurrent. So somehow the settings of Alice's camera have to change not only the particle that Alice photographs, but instantly change the particle that Bob sees on the other side of the universe. That's the hypothesis. And now you might think, well, there has to be more to it than that. They must have a theoretical model about what these hidden variables here are and how they do what they do. And the answer is no, they don't. There is no theoretical model of the hidden variables.
Wait, hold on a second. Am I really this deluded? Super determinism. Super determinism. All choices being measured are correlated with choices of the experimenter. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to have to do more research. I don't have time to do this right now. Am I really this off base? Okay.
Or toy models that don't apply to the real world. They apply only to toy universes. So they're merely mathematical exercises with no relationship to reality. Nobody has made a proposal about what these hidden variables that do this magic might be. Nobody has anywhere near a workable model of these, the way these hidden variables work. The way the hidden variables are defined is in terms of what they need to do. In other words, the postulate...
Wait, is he talking about pilot wave theory? I think, I don't know. So it sounds like he's, to me, talking about three different things. Super determinism, that, well, like I just read, the choices of the researcher are somehow determined by the experimental setup. And the idea that reality, that there really is a collapse, that reality is not classical, and then collapses, and then the idea that there's a pilot wave guiding some hidden variable. Maybe he just means, yeah, I don't really, I'm sort of lost about what the critique here is, but
Is
I'm sure
that
someone's
there
straighten me out.
are hidden things in nature that do whatever needs to be done so we can continue to believe in physicalism. That's how it is defined. Um, and I don't think that's
How does it
valid.
have to do
I
with
don't think that's a
physicalism?
valid move in science. Um, there was an experiment proposed to try to find hidden variables even without defining the hidden variables. Normally, you can only find something if you define it. Like Peter Higgs defined the Higgs boson and gave us energy ranges and gave us possibilities about what it would decay into. He did all that in the 1960s, and then we found it in 2012 because he gave us what to look for. And without defining the hidden variables, we don't have what to look for. So we can't design an experiment. So there was an attempt several years ago to come up with an experiment that could find them even without defining them. I don't know if you want to get into the details of the experiment. I'll not talk about the details right now, but after I'm done with this answer, you can always ask me and I will give you the details then. But the problem with that experiment is that it is unfalsifiable. In other words, if it doesn't find the hidden variables, you cannot conclude that there are no hidden variables. It is an experiment that cannot falsify the hypothesis it is testing. In other words, it's not a valid experiment because it will never give us closure. It's fundamentally incapable of giving us closure. So we don't have a definition of the hidden variables, we don't have a definition of their mechanism of action, and we don't have an experiment. So in other words, it's pure fantasy that aims at sustaining a prejudice. If these two fantasies, superdeterminism and Evereshian many worlds, if these are the physical theories that Sean Carroll is referring to when he says that we have a theoretical account of the experiments that disprove non-contextuality, which is this notion that what Bob sees depends on what Alice chooses to measure. It's technically called non-contextuality. So if he's saying that there's a theoretical, acknowledged theoretical way to to um, to argue that non-contextuality was falsified by 45 years of experimentation and a Nobel Prize, if he's referring to these two fantasies, then it's nonsense. Then it's just a reflection of his own ability to believe in his favorite metaphysical prejudice. If he does not want to part with the notion that physical entities have standalone reality, then he will take this theoretical fantasy seriously, but that's an expression of belief and preference, that there is no science in here. Science entails experimentation.
I don't know. Does the many worlds interpretation postulate things with standalone properties? Postulates the wave function, then we make measurements, and the universe splits into things with definite properties, classical properties. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, this whole rant I think is unfair, but anyway, I've already said
And
enough about it.
empirical evidence, none of these two hypotheses, neither of them has anything remotely related to empirical evidence and experiment. On the contrary, they make the hidden variables in the parallel universes sort of fundamentally inaccessible to experiment and evidence. The alternative is much simpler. The alternative is that what is measured is not physical in the sense of not being characterizable through physical quantities. In the same way that let's use an analogy that I often use. Take an airplane. An airplane has sensors that measure the states of the sky outside the airplane. And the results of those measurements are displayed on the dials on a dashboard. If the airplane doesn't measure anything, then the dashboard displays nothing, right? But that doesn't mean that the thing measured didn't exist. No, it's only the measurement that didn't happen. The sky is still out there. It still has the states that it has. But because those states were not measured, the dashboard shows nothing. What the dashboard does show when you make a measurement is something that is correlated with the states of the sky, but is not itself the states of the sky. In other words, the dashboard is not the sky, but you can fly by instruments alone at night in a storm, because the states of the dashboard convey information about the states of the sky without being the sky. Under analytic idealism, the physical world is a dashboard, and we are flying by instruments all the time. We also have sensors like the airplane: retinas, eardrums, outer surface of the skin, lining of the nose, and the papilla of the tongue. These are our sensors. They measure the real world out there. And those measurements are reported to us in the form of an internal dashboard that we call perception, or the colloquially physical world, the things we see, smell, taste, touch, and so on. If we don't measure, then nothing appears on the dashboard. And that's why physical entities do not have standalone existence before measurement. Physical entities are dashboard representations. If you don't measure, then there are no physical entities. You see?
Wait, hold on.
If
This is the much simpler alternative. Okay, so it's difficult to go from that to this because the level of sarcasm and misunderstanding was very high, and now this is this. Okay, so how to proceed? The analogy is fine. Yes, sure. Nothing shows up on the sensors, but there could still be something out there. Okay, fantastic. So we don't make a measurement. We're supposed to think that the thing is still there. Okay, but how does that reconcile what we see from quantum mechanics with Alice and Bob? How does this supposed to make sense of that? I mean, if you really take this dashboard stuff seriously, then that kind of is the view of the consciousness collapses the wave function view, which is that if there's no sensory interaction with the external world, then the things are just in an indeterminate state, a non-classical state described by the wave function. Then when they causally interact with a mind, you get perceptions of the external world, the definite states correspondingly out there are described by the map. So how is this different than that, and how does this connect to the idea that he was critiquing of the other thing? That maybe that was an internal critique from before, because there you would get the interactions among particles. That's supposed to objectively collapse these or something like that. So his idea is that if you're not interacting with it, I mean, so suppose that you set up this experiment, but you don't look at the results of it, the double slit, like what's going to be there in reality. So the double slit, you have the two slits, you're shooting the things. What pattern is there? The pattern of the interference pattern with the multiple bands, or the pattern of the non-interference pattern? What's there before you look at it? So on the view that I'm friendly to, it's indeterminate before you observe it. On his view, it's what? I mean, I'm not really sure. I kind of, let's see, the idealist. Yeah, how is this supposed to? I got to hear this again. Hold on, let's back up for a second.
the nose and the papilla of the tongue. These are our sensors. They measure the real world out there. And those measurements are reported to us in the form of an internal dashboard that we call perception, or the colloquially physical world, the things we see, smell, taste, touch, and so on. If we don't...
I don't think ordinary persons are going to think that the physical world are the sensations. You have to be already, I guess, deep into some theory before that starts to make sense. But I see what we know what he means, I guess.
Measure, then nothing appears on the dashboard. And that's why physical entities do not have standalone existence before measurement. Physical entities are dashboard representations. If you don't measure, then there are no physical entities. You see?
Yeah, so that's the physical entities are dashboard representations. There hasn't been an argument for that, that physical entities are the things in perception. They are the things we perceive, but I don't think I perceive my perception. I don't perceive experience. I perceive the external world by having experience. When I talked to Bernardo the first time, this kind of came up, but only tangentially. I don't think he really wanted to address it, but he clearly has a theory of perception, which invokes the veil of perception from the classical period, whereby what I'm looking at right now is not the external world in any sense, but an experience of mine, an experience which I perceive and indirectly then come into contact with something else or something like that. Whereas the more contemporary view of perception is that right now what I'm looking at is the physical world. By having an experience, either by representing it or by being directly in contact with it, people will debate about that. But the idea, you shouldn't mistake the idea that experience represents things with the idea that what you perceive is your representation. You don't perceive the representation one might think. One might think you perceive the world. Now, how you perceive the world, of course, is what's at issue. So we have, so a lot of this depends on a theory of perception. And that theory of perception is debatable and perhaps, there might be reasons for not taking that theory of perception at face value. So that really, a lot depends on what he just said. Physical objects are representations on the dashboard. They're experiences. The physical object is the thing the experience you have. Whereas what I was saying is a physical object is a thing that your experience puts you in touch with. There is a lot at stake here. So I don't think very much that this idealist interpretation of quantum mechanics really works. The state is there. It's not being measured by you, so it's it's not an experience of yours. So therefore, it's not a physical thing according to this view. But you can just ask a different question, I guess. Then, well, what is it in its own sense? Because it's got to be describing something. And if it's especially a universal mind and those things out there are properties of it, then it looks like it's got to be, then something out there has got to be in this state. Or I'm not sure how to make sense of this, but yeah, so, okay, but at least I think I have a better understanding of how he's trying to put this together, although I don't agree.
If you don't measure, then there are no physical entities. You see? If Bob and Alice don't make a measurement, then there are no physical entities. There is no sense to saying that physical entities exist prior to a measurement.
Sure, but if Alice measures it, then she's going to have some physical entity, aka experience. And Bob's going to have some physical entity, aka experience. What is in this picture allows those things to be correlated in the way that entanglement requires. I guess maybe he'll say, I don't know.
For the same reason that there is no sense in saying that dashboard indications have existence prior to the sensors making a measurement. They don't exist prior to a measurement because they are representations of the measurement outcome. Physical entities are representations of measurement outcomes. Therefore, they don't exist if no measurement is done. And it's trivial. It's not magic. It's not difficult to understand. It's not mind-boggling. Physical entities are not the real entities of the world as it is in itself. Physical entities are phenomenal representations that arise upon our measuring the world. And what is the world?
I mean, by the way, so this picture has at least relatives that go way back when. I haven't read all his books about Schopenhauer and Hegel and all these guys, but certainly I know about Kant, and that something like this was Kant's view. that what we mean by physical is the thing in experience. And all of this talk about something outside of experience is sort of leading us astray. So there's certainly antecedents of this that have been well known. But what is the world according to him? I want to hear what he's going to say.
The world is made of mental states that are themselves not describable through physical quantities. What is the length in centimeters of a thought? What's the weight in kilograms of an emotion? But those real states, non-physical real states of the world, they exist whether we are measuring or not, but they're not physical. So
So they don't have. So I don't understand this argument. So they're not physical, so they don't have determinate properties. I mean, what I was saying is that there are physical properties that are not classical. They don't have determinate values. So spin up, spin down, being here, being there. So yeah, that boggles our mind. How could it be that way? I don't know. The math says math is good. Math good, okay? So math says figure it out. That's one way the world could be. It would suck for us if we couldn't understand it. But I've been on a rant about that, lady, so I'll go on again about it here. People really seem to want the world to be intelligible to them. It may just be that it isn't. So, it would suck. I would hate it. Aristotle says humans by nature desire to know. We do, I think, at least some of us. Hume said nature retains the right to say fuck off. It's paraphrased. My cousin Hume said that. What are you talking about? No. Anyway, that nature retains the right to foil our theoretical aspirations. It just may not be the case that nature is the way we want it to be. The world may not be intelligible. And, so, okay, that would suck. But it could be that way. But it's not physical, therefore it's not going to be quantified. But we have some quantities here. What? It just seems like what the math is telling us that the thing out there has both of them or all of them. How does this help with that? I don't really see.
No,
I might be
they're
missing
not
something,
physical.
though, to be honest.
So, I lost my train of thought, but there's something else I want to account, which is the correlation between what Bob sees and what Alice sees.
Okay.
This instantaneous correlation at a distance, which
Good.
Einstein characterized as a spooky action at a distance. This too disappears if we understand that physical entities are just representations upon measurement of real states of the world, but aren't themselves the real states of the world. And I would do that through another analogy. Suppose you are a football fan and you want to watch the game from your home. You're not going to the stadium is far away, and you buy two enormous television sets to watch the same game through two different broadcasters, say ESPN and NBC. And you're watching the game through these two different broadcasters in your living room at the same time. Now imagine also that ESPN has their own cameras in the stadium and NBC has their own cameras too. So the images on the two television screens will be different because they are taken through different camera angles and so forth.
Yeah,
but they will be completely correlated because they are images of the same game, the real thing in the stadium. If there were a time traveler from the 18th century that came to visit you and were watching the game with you, he would be discombobulated, because how can the little man in the box to the left know exactly where the little man in the box to the right are going and act in a way that is instantaneously correlated at the difference, even though the two boxes are not communicating to one another? There is no wire, there's nothing there. How do they know where the other little men are going so they can move in a consistent way?
Yeah, this doesn't address the main difficulty, which is that the way that Alice makes her measurement determines that this thing's going to be, let's say there's two options, spin up. So that means that when Bob makes his measurement, it has to be spin down. It has to be, because there's only two options, spin up or spin down. So it's going to be one. She makes her measurement. Now we know which one he's going to pick. If Alice had picked differently, then his would have been differently. So how does this make that work? Which is what the mathematics seems to suggest. How does that fall out of this. It doesn't. Yeah, I get how you get, there's some real thing out there. You have these two things that are correlated with it. But it's like, whether or not there was a touchdown in the game depends on whether or not Alice was pointing her camera over there, as opposed to pointing her camera over there where the ball went off to the side, right? Both outcomes are 50-50. So she could pick either one. I mean, I get how this explains the instantaneous correlation. And this is what everyone has always wanted to say. There's some classical thing out there that already had the property. That's why it turns out this way. But that was disproven by all the Bell equalities and stuff like that. So I don't really see how this is helping with that, to be honest with you.
It's magical. It's spooky action at a distance. Why does the time traveler think that? Because the time traveler mistakes the representation for the thing in itself. The images on the television screen are not the game. They are representations of the game. The actual game is happening at the stadium. And if you have two different representations of the same underlying reality, yes, they will be instantaneously correlated at a distance, and there is no problem unless you regard the two representations as the things in themselves. Now you have a problem. If you think there are real little men running around inside one box and other real little men running around inside the other.
Yeah, so this is what I was saying before. So, I mean, the only difference is that he wants to call that stuff out there mental or something, whereas I was just saying it's not classical, but it is physical, so they're not mental. So I don't see how this argument gets him to that it's mental or that has... So, I don't know. I'd have to hear more from him about this.
The fact that their behavior is synchronized is discombobulating when they can't communicate with one another in different boxes. So, that's what we see with these experiments in quantum entanglement. Entangled particles are not two different entities. Entangled particles are two different representations of the same underlying non-physical but real state of the world. And that's why they are always correlated, just because they are two camera angles into the same reality. That real state that is measured, it is what it is, and it exists independent of observation. It is there before we measured it. But our choice of what to measure is our choice of camera angle. And therefore, the image produced depends on our choice of the camera angle, because it gives us the perspective.
Yeah, but but that analogy doesn't work, because in his previous analogy, you got the two TVs, two different broadcasts, different cameras. Alice and Bob, different cameras, different dashboards. So her choice, how does that affect his? That's the question. He hasn't answered that as far as I can tell.
Through which we look at the real state of the world. That's what we call collapse.
It's interesting, because I was just thinking that this debate between Bernardo and I would be similar to a debate between Kant and others, because Bernardo wants to say what a physical object is the thing that in your experience, whereas I would say the physical object is the thing out there, what he's calling the world, which he thinks is mental. So I would say that's the physical stuff out there. So yeah, interesting. I mean, don't get me wrong. I see reasons for liking analytic idealism, but they mostly depend on the hard problem and stuff like that. But this stuff, I think, I'm not really seeing how it fits together or helps. I mean, it's great to have an interpretation of quantum mechanics that fits with your view of consciousness, but I don't really see this working.
Production of a representation. It's not a magical thing. We are not magically changing the real state of the world. We are only producing a different representation of it upon measurement, because we choose how we look at the world. You see? So collapse is a translation of the real state of the world into one of our internal representations. And it only happens when we measure, because to represent something, we need to measure it. It's like expecting the dashboard to produce an indication when the airplane sensors are not measuring anything. That's not how it works. And it's not magical. It's not complicated. It's not unreasonable. It's not discombobulating. But we have to face 21st century evidence with 21st century eyes and not with the eyes of the 18th century time traveler, which is what physicalists are trying to do. They still want to think like somebody from before the time of.
I mean, this just isn't fair. I agree that we don't want to think in pre-classically, pre-quantum mechanically. But what's the argument that the stuff out there has to be mental? That hasn't been given. Just that it doesn't have definite quantities. Yeah, so it's not classical. Okay, great. So we got to update our conception of what it means to be physical. Welcome to the 21st century. Idealism not required.
Of Goethe, some early 18th century idiot. That's how they want to think about these things.
18th
And
century.
therefore, invisible parallel universes and magical hidden variables.
I'm gonna have to.
Okay, so yeah, completely interesting, but not very fair. So let me come back and I want to get through the rest of this. I was going to go look up some stuff on superdeterminism. Now I don't know what the hell is real anymore. But let me try to get through this first. I only have a little bit of time. Maybe I can do it. Maybe I'll have to do it later. We'll see.